and welcome to Rising. We've got a special edition of the show for you today. Robbie is out sick. You'll never guess why. You know, he lost his voice playing too much Dungeons and Dragons the other night. So I have the delight of being joined at the desk today by Shermichael Singleton. Welcome, Shermichael.
Bree, thanks for having me. I mean, I'm so excited to actually be in the studio with you for once. I mean, I miss Robbie, I'm going to be honest. I hope to see him soon, but it's good to be next to you.
Robbie sowed the seeds of his own destruction. He knows what he did. He knows he can't be out during a weeknight hollering up with the boys.
Robbie, we're not young anymore, bro. We're not young anymore.
All right, well, we've got some big stories to get into today. First up, former President Trump hit Truth Social last night with major demands for Republicans on the Hill. Quote, a very important deadline is approaching at the end of the month. Republicans in Congress can and must defund all aspects of crooked Joe Biden's weaponized government that refuses to close the border and treats half the country as enemies of the state. This is also the last chance to defund these political prosecutions against me and other patriots. They failed on the debt limit, but they must not fail now. Use the power of the purse and defend the country. Rolling Stone reports that privately the former president is bugging out over the possibility of serving prison time. The ex-president has repeatedly asked his confidants and attorneys if he'd have to wear one of those jumpsuits behind bars.
Now back to the shutdown. If Speaker Kevin McCarthy fails to get the votes needed, the government will shut down at the end of next week. Republicans in the Senate are doubtful McCarthy can do it with the party's majority alone. Several senators told The Hill they predict the speaker will need to court some Democratic votes if he wants to see the bill passed. I'm not surprised by that.
You're not surprised by the need to get Democrats across the aisle?
No. I mean, I think the Freedom Caucus, I think this time around, they're going to have to stand their ground on this, Bree. I mean, I've spoken with several chiefs of staff to some of the members on the Freedom Caucus side, and a lot of their constituents were really unhappy with what occurred several months ago. And so now they're feeling it not only from the voters, but also some of their key donors of, hey, you need to stand your ground on this. There's some major cuts that needs to occur before we approve any type of continuing resolution.
So this is the dynamic that's been playing out ever since the force the vote moment with Kevin McCarthy at the beginning of the year, where the Freedom Caucus, combined with Donald Trump from the sidelines, has wanted a more conservative isn't quite the way to say it. The factions in the Republican Party have more to do with whether or not you're for or against military spending in Ukraine and some of these issues that are not falling among...
Which most Americans are now against.
Right, including, and this has been historically a left issue as well, and that's why I hesitate just to say they're more right. I would say they're more anti-establishment, let's say, than the Republican Party. Kevin McCarthy got through this temporary kind of Band-Aid deal a couple of months ago, and now there's this question of whether or not these Freedom Caucus people can really get much more if they hold out. I can understand from a political perspective why they would like to be able to say that they held out and they fought and take that information back home to their districts. But realistically, Kevin McCarthy and the Democrats are united in their interest in keeping the government open. And do you really think that ultimately it's going to make any difference? Are they going to use one of the concessions that they got from the force the vote moment in January to try to kick Kevin McCarthy out of office, out of the leadership position, rather? Do they have the votes for that, or is this all going to be a round of performative voting?
So from my understanding, they don't have the votes for that. And as some Republican senators have stated, even if we were to concede to some of the things that the Freedom Caucus have asked for, it wouldn't pass the Senate. We just do not have the votes or the support in the Senate for many of these initiatives. And so it's best to try to get something accomplished. But I do think the Freedom Caucus, I think there's an overall point that they're trying to make that's pretty salient for most Americans. A few days ago, we surpassed $33 trillion, Bree, in debt. $33 trillion. That's roughly around $50,000 to $60,000+ per American. As someone who's eligible to work, that is. And so when you're talking about people being able to pay off this debt, they're thinking about giving a future that's better than the present for their children and their grandchildren, that reality doesn't exist. And so I think to make the argument of, hey, we're going to vote for something, but we do need to change some of the spending habits in this country, we need to pay down some of the debt, I think that's a fair point. And I also think to make the argument that it's also a national security risk is also a legitimate point to make.
So I'm with you if we're still talking about the spending that is, frankly, the biggest bucket of spending in this country, which is outside of some basic healthcare and social programs.
I know where you're going.
Military spending. But here's the problem, Shermichael. People who watch this show know that I sat down Marjorie Taylor Greene. We've seen this from members of the more conservative flank of the Republican Party. And when asked directly whether or not they want there to be cuts to the military budget, not just spending for Ukraine, but the military budget more holistically, they say no. Yeah. So what do you do with that?
I don't disagree with that. I mean, China right now is perhaps as strong as it has ever been over the past several decades. They're now leading the charge with BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now there are other countries that are joining. For the viewers, if you're not aware, I would say Google BRICS. You should be aware of this, Bree.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about
there are some serious economic implications for the United States and the power of the dollar international in that regard. Look at their aggressions in the South China Sea. They're bolstering their military. I mean, so there are some serious things that I think the United States need to be aware of in terms of our ability to continue to be the nation's, or the world's leader, if you will, that could at some point in the next decade or two be usurped by China's aggression economically and militarily. So it's the absolute wrong time to decrease military spending.
All right. Well, that puts you out of step with, as you mentioned, the majority of the public who isn't, I think,
and I'm okay with that.
With Ukraine, but preoccupied with U.S. global hegemony, imperialism, and all of those kinds of things in a way that, frankly, as a leftist is very heartening. But I think we're going to see a test of how sincere the kind of anti-war beliefs of the Freedom Caucus members and others really are. I just wanted to ask you about the Trump piece of this. Yeah. He seems to be trying to kind of weaponize this standoff and inject himself into the middle of it and say, you got to hold out on this funding. You got to defund the powers that would put me in jail. You got to defund the Justice Department. You got to defund those who would want to weaponize the government against me. Do you think that is going to be a helpful pitch as the Freedom Caucus tries to get votes to get a more advantageous, more anti-establishment deal
here? Well, I
here?
definitely think it helps them in their ability to say, no, we're not going to vote for something. I think it helps individuals like the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, Lauren Boeberts, Matthew Gaetz in particular, who really has been one of the main members saying if McCarthy goes too far, then maybe we need another speaker. And so I think it's effective in that regard. But I would caution the former president, who will likely be the nominee again of my party, who I once worked for, that we should consider the implications of this in a general election. We're talking about vets. How are we going to pay them? We're talking about other bills that the United States has already ran up that we have to pay. Creditors are going to expect those funds. Most of the major banks right now are not only buying less Treasury notes, they're offsetting. They're trying to sell them as much as possible because they don't have confidence in the U.S. economy right now. And so I think when you think about all of those things, you think about commodities going up, energy going up, inflation is still a pretty significant problem. The Fed chair just stated yesterday that he's likely going to have to raise rates again at one of the two remaining meetings to come, so before the year is out. And so Americans are really feeling the burn. I'm just not certain if now is the best economic time to shut down the government, because I'm partially concerned about the overall implications.
I mean, historically, the party that's seen as responsible for shutting down the government loses. They take the hit. So that is exactly why Kevin McCarthy and the bulk of establishment Republicans don't want this to happen. And I think there's a question as to whether or not the Freedom Caucus and Trump are going to be seen as working against the interest of the Republican Party as a whole and their electoral strategy going forward into 2024.
I hope not, but I agree with the argument that we have to pay down the debt. This is insane. Most Americans, they have to balance a budget every month. We don't have the ability to just continue to print more money as if there's no tomorrow. And so why should the government be ran, in a way that most American families don't run their households?
We don't have time to get into the questions about whether or not the comparison between household debt and national debt is an accurate one, given the realities of monetary theory.
I'm not necessarily trying to have a direct link in that comparative analysis. What I'm saying is the thought process and how one pays their bills and prioritizes what should be paid, how they expense things, how they spend their money, that should translate to our lawmakers.
Right. Well, again, that's a much broader NMT conversation that we don't have time for now. I just want to say for the record that I dispute that. Perhaps we can talk about it in a segment some other time. Stick around. We'll have more Rising for you right after this.